This
He is the
conference
Chittenden
will now be recorded.
Forester, and he's great. So thank you, Ethan, for coming today.
Thanks, Ashley. So my name's Ethan Tapper. I'm the Chittenden County Forester. For those of you who don't know who I am or what county foresters do, the County Forester program has been around in Vermont since the 1940s. There's 13 of us, county foresters for Vermont's 14 counties, and our primary role is to help people manage their forested land more responsibly. That takes a few different forms. I say it has generally 4 parts. Part number 1, we manage this program called the Use Value Appraisal Program, also known as the Current Use Program or Land Use, which is a tax abatement program for landowners who own 25 acres or more of forested land. They agree to manage their land responsibly and not to subdivide or develop it. And we approve all the forest management plans, and we monitor them, and we make sure that people are managing their land well. It's a really important land use program in Vermont. Part number 2 is that we're just a general resource to private landowners. You can call us up if you have a couple acres or a couple thousand acres, and we'll just come out and advise you on how to manage your forest responsibly. Part number 3, we help towns manage their municipal or town forests. So I've worked with Ashley a bunch on thinking about Red Rocks and some of South Burlington's other town-owned properties, but I actually work on about a dozen town forests in Chittenden County. If you're in Chittenden County, all of them are probably within 45 minutes of where you are now, and they're about over 4,000 acres of public land that are owned by municipalities. And part number 4 is that I and all the other county foresters are just sort of tasked with this big question of how do we improve the health of forests and the quality of forest management in our county. Each county is really different, and how we answer that question will be different and should respond to the unique challenges and opportunities afforded by each county. And so in Chittenden County and in many of the other counties, invasive plants are a really, really big deal. And so, I've agreed to come and talk. I talk to people about invasive plants all the time. I've agreed to come and do this presentation just because I think that, the way we think about proactively dealing with invasive plants and how we're actually going to get to a place of controlling them is really, really important. And we got to use sometimes unusual tools to get where we need to go. So with that, I'm gonna start my presentation. I'm gonna start just by sort of talking about what invasives are, why they're problematic, and then we're gonna get into some of the more granular stuff of how we manage them. And so I think what would be best for me is if folks would put questions, hold questions till the end, either put questions in the chat, or we'll also, at the bottom left of your screen, there should be a hand tool icon, so like to raise your hand. And you can put that up if you want to ask me a question just verbally as well.
Ethan, so I'm just going to chime in.
Yeah.
We don't have the hand option.
Oh, okay. I have the hand.
Oh, you do?
I have it on the bottom left. Anybody else have the hand? Raise your hand if you got one. No. Okay, so we'll just do it by the chat. Great. Catherine says no hand. Okay.
I have the hand. It's there.
Oh, very nice.
Okay.
So if you got it, use it by all means. All right. Everybody see that? Ashley, can you see that?
Yes, I can see that.
Yep. Great. All right. So I'm calling this controlling non-native invasive plants in your forest. Obviously, we're going to touch on the using herbicide as a control, as a restoration tool. But I want to talk about control in general first to sort of set the table. So what are invasive plants? So invasive plants are, what are invasive exotic plants, I should say. So we call them exotic or non-native. Basically, these are plants, animals, pathogens, pests that are outside of their native range. So they are evolved and adapted to some other environment, and they're here, right? They are called invasive if they're spreading prolifically in a way that's harmful. So, if we're farmers, we might consider an invasive plant or a pest to be something that's inhibiting our ability to grow food. In this case, what I'm talking about is specifically plants that are harmful to our ecosystems and to our biodiversity. That's what an invasive plant is in this context. We have a lot of introduced species. So of 2,800 plant species in Vermont, about 600 are thought to be introduced. Most of these, the vast majority, are not considered invasive. There's a few invasive plants, and really, of the invasive plants that we're encountering in the woods, there's just like a handful, like 10, that are really, really problematic. And then a few sort of more minor ones that are sort of regionally problematic. So all these invasive plants share particular characteristics. This is a picture from you, Bob. Invasive plants on the right, treated invasive plants on the left from one of Bob's projects. What are they like? They're fast spreading. They are generalists, so they can grow kind of anywhere. Many of them are allelopathic, which just means that they are injecting chemicals into the soil that are inhibiting the growth of other plants. Most plants are allelopathic in some respect, but plants that we consider to be quote unquote allelopathic are ones that really do this. And many of these invasive plants do. Some of them have like really diabolical strategies, like garlic mustard specifically puts chemicals in the soil that inhibit the growth of mycorrhizal fungi. Mycorrhizal fungi is these symbiotic fungal networks that associate with the roots of trees, and most trees and plants require mycorrhizal fungi in order to grow. It helps them take up nutrients from the soil. It also helps them connect with one another. And garlic mustard does not need mycorrhizal fungi, and so it kills the mycorrhizal fungi in the soil, inhibiting the ability of other plants which require it to grow. Most invasive exotic plants are extremely resilient, which just means that they're really, really hard to kill. So they're good at layering, which means sprouting, reproducing vegetatively. So in the case of knotweed, sometimes reproducing from like a 1 or 2 inch piece of shoot. Many of these plants are just really great at staying alive and sprouting. They seed prolifically, many of them. So a lot of these species that we're dealing with have seeds which are dispersed by wildlife. And which are, can be carried long distances. So an example of this is like buckthorn, which has these blackberries that birds eat. It gives them diarrhea, and they spread buckthorn seeds everywhere. One of the biggest reasons why these invasive plants have all these attributes that make them so dominant, that make them outcompete our native plants, is that they are evolved for somewhere else. So you can think about when species evolve, they evolve not in response to every other organism, every other condition, every other site in the world, but they're just evolving and adapting in response to the conditions in the species in their native range. So it's an arms race in a way, but it's not an arms race between every organism in the earth. It's an arms race between these specific organisms that co-occur. So the organisms that exist here, our native plants, are not adapted to these organisms that evolve somewhere else entirely in the world. And these organisms that evolve somewhere else in the world are not constrained by the natural constraints of their environment, which requires them to be sort of more in balance. And so that's why they just go crazy and take everything over, and are very, very difficult for our native species to compete with. So there are examples of this, species of plants that are native to here, red oak, yellow birch, black cherry, that are invasive plants and are real biodiversity threats in other parts of the world. Another weird example of this is that the minks, so a small member of the weasel family that's native to North America, is a real biodiversity threat in Europe. Well, why do we care? So the main reason why we care about invasive plants is that they're displacing our native species. So in doing that, they're affecting all of the whole ecosystem. So all the organisms that have relationships with those native species, the natural processes, relationships, associations associated with those native species. There are some acute impacts. So in the case of our non-native invasive plants, there are less nutritious food. Their berries are less nutritious for like neotropical songbirds, which will feed on berries and then go on these really intensive seasonal migrations. They support much lower invertebrate densities, so invertebrates, bugs, that are fed on by many of our native bird species and are sort of the base of our forest food webs. They are supporting a much lower density of those organisms. And just in general, we need to recognize that ecosystems are these really complex systems. They're defined by their relationships, by their interactions, by the processes that drive them. they're resilient, but they're also, in a way, they're somewhat delicate. So it's easy to damage those relationships by introducing something like a non-native plant or an organism. And it has these massive cascading implications for the ecosystem and its ability to be an ecosystem. So in a global context, along with habitat loss and climate change, what we call biological invasions, invasive organisms, are a major threat to global biodiversity. They account for about half of all extinctions of which the cause is known. And according to the National Wildlife Federation, 42% of endangered species are primarily threatened by invasives. Now, I should say that this is primarily invasive animals. So an example of that on the left is the brown tree snake. You know, on the island of Guam, there are no native snakes. As with many island ecosystems, they don't necessarily have a huge amount of native biodiversity, and so they only had 12 native bird species, all of which are now functionally extinct due to this one creature. So we care because non-native plants, animals, pests, and pathogens are major threats to global biodiversity and to these organisms that have existed here for thousands of years and are extremely related to the function of our ecosystems in general. We also care because these invasive exotic plants are yet another of many human-caused stressors on our ecosystems. So when, we obviously are really concerned about climate change. It's this really sort of existential threat to our world. But many scientists now talk about global change. What global change is the threat of climate change plus other human-caused stressors, which includes altered natural disturbance regimes, invasive exotic biological invasions, invasive exotic plants, animals, pests, pathogens, forest loss, the conversion of forest to other uses, the fragmentation of forest to smaller and smaller pieces, pollution, extinction. All of these things are combined with climate change to form this like really scary brew of the massive threats to our ecosystems and to the function of our planet. And it's really, really challenging because we need to, at the same time, help our ecosystems recover from the wounds of the past, how they've already been damaged. But we also need to help them be adaptive and resilient when we know that the future is uncertain. We don't know what ecosystems we're going to have in the future. We don't know what our natural disturbance regimes are going to be like. And so we need to manage ecosystems that are resilient and adaptive at the same time that we're trying to bring them back to a condition where they're healthier. We're losing biodiversity really, really fast. So we know of, previous to now, we know of 5 major extinction events where the Earth lost a huge amount of its biodiversity, and we believe that we're now in the 6th. So this period of time is called, by many in the scientific community, the Anthropocene. It's a geologic epoch in which humans are the dominant influence on the Earth's climate and our ecology. And with this is coming a massive constriction of biodiversity. So according to the UN, global animal populations are 68% lower today than they were in 1970. That means there are 68% less animals on the planet than there were 50 years ago. And we're losing them really, really fast. We think that about 1 million animal and plant species are now threatened with extinction of the 2 to 10 million that exist on the planet. More than 40% of amphibians are threatened, about 1/3 of reef-forming corals, about 1/3 of marine mammals. Since the 1600s, we've lost almost 700 species of vertebrate animals, and perhaps, of the invertebrates, the bugs, which make up about 97% of all the species on Earth, we've lost conservatively 100,000 species. We care because forests and other ecosystems massively influence our quality of life all the time. So they're providing us with clean air, with clean water, habitat for wildlife, carbon sequestration and storage, habitat for pollinators, which are pollinating our food crops. They're mitigating and attenuating floodwaters. They're preventing erosion. They're regulating our weather and our climate. They're beautiful, making Vermont a beautiful place to live in. They're massively influencing the culture and the character of our rural environments. They're supporting our working landscape. There's incredible economic benefits to the tune of over $3 billion a year from forestry and forest-based recreation. It's really, really important. And then I would also posit that they are important intrinsically. because they have the right to exist, because these ecosystems and these organisms are important in and of themselves. So biodiversity matters for ecosystems. It's the currency of ecosystems in a way, their ability to be resilient, to be adaptive in an uncertain future. For wildlife, it means biodiversity means different types of habitat, habitat for all different types of organisms. For humans, it means these massive array of public benefits and ecosystem services. And they're intrinsically important, that these organisms and the ecosystems they inhabit, I would argue, have the right to exist independent of their value to humans. So pivoting a little bit, one of the ways that one of the really important skills in being able to control invasive exotic plants is being able to identify them. I'm not going to go into specifically, how you identify each and every species. On my YouTube channel a few weeks ago, I did a presentation, and you can find a recording of it where I went into how to identify common invasive plants. What I will say is that of the most common invasive plants, you don't need to learn every single invasive on the Vermont noxious weeds list. You can just learn these ones. These are the most common ones. There are other ones that are going to be coming down the pike all the time, but these are the ones you're going to see the most. By far, the two most common, shrub honeysuckle and common buckthorn. Probably third on that list and fourth is Japanese barberry, Asiatic or Oriental bittersweet, glossy buckthorn, and multiflora rose. These are all plants that I know are present to some degree in South Burlington's city parks. Less prominent but still around is autumn olive and Russian olive, black swallowwort, also called dog strangling vine, burning bush, and non-woody species. So these are woody species that have wood, non-woodies to be aware of that interact with forests and other ecosystems are Japanese knotweed, called by some old timers bamboo, which is really scary. Phragmites, common reed, which you've probably seen all along the side of the road. It's that thing with a big tassel, big tall plant, and garlic mustard. And you can find details on identifying all these species at vtinvasives.org. The other tool that I think you should check out is iNaturalist. So this is an iPhone app that uses a combination of artificial intelligence and crowdsourcing to help you identify all different kinds of species. So you can just snap a picture of it on your phone, put it through the app, and it will either tell you what it is, or it will put it out to this huge community of really dedicated naturalists, and they'll tell you what it is. So if you own a piece of land, even if it's a tiny little piece, the first step in being able to control invasive plants is being able to identify them and know where they are and what they are. So as we think about controlling invasive plants, we need to get clear about our terminology. So eradicating invasive plants at this point from our landscape is not an option. We just couldn't do it even if we wanted to, right? So instead, we need to focus on this idea of control. So what control is being able to keep populations at a low enough level that they're not negatively influencing biodiversity. On an individual parcel or an individual piece of land, what that means is essentially we're pulling up new arrivals. We've dealt with the problem, but we're pulling up new arrivals as they sprout, and they're little tiny plants, so they're really easy to pull up before they become established. And they don't have a chance to bear seeds, and we're just dealing with them progressively as we go. And so what this means as stewards and people who love places like Red Rocks Park and Wheeler Park is that it's up to us to know what these species look like and to quickly deal with them. And so our goal is to get to that place of control where we can manage them on that level of low intensity. One of the things I think about a lot, and this goes into a lot of the things I just talked about, sort of about how altered our landscape is and how important it is that we do something to try and make our ecosystems healthy again, is this idea of responsibility. So what do we owe to our ecosystems? Are we responsible for solving these problems that humans created, like this loss of biodiversity, like the introduction of these invasive plants, like our simplified integrated forests? Is that our responsibility? I would argue that it is. And then it asks the question, should that Should that feel simple or easy or comfortable? Or are we willing to get uncomfortable? Are we willing to do things that are challenging, that are hard, both physically hard and ideologically hard? It's a really, really big challenge and requires us to really dive into the nuances of how we interact with the relationship that we have with our ecosystems, how we interact with them, how we see our role in our ecosystems. So one of the first things that you can do, and we talked about this sort of with the level of control, is that if we're proactive, we don't have to make that many hard decisions. So if you're proactive and you know what these species look like, a small patch of invasive plants can be eliminated before it becomes a problem. The farther that progresses, the less options you have, and the more serious the ecological damage becomes. The harder it is to bring those forests back. So now I want to talk a little bit about what options we have for dealing with plants when you find them. So the first suite of options are what I call mechanical control, what Ashley called manual control. Basically what this is control without using chemicals. So the other option that I'm going to talk about is chemical control. And then there's also hybrid methods. So what mechanical control is it's what is being done in South Burlington right now at these city parks. So it's hand pulling, it's girdling, which is where you just cut around the circumference of a living plant or tree, burning sometimes with a flame weeder, cutting, so just cutting a plant, and smothering, which is using usually thick black plastic to smother populations of plants. This is usually employed with stuff like goutweed and sometimes Japanese knotweed. Hand pulling is, so I would just say that, first of all, that hand pulling is by far the best way to deal with invasive plants. The problem is that it's not always appropriate. So in order to pull plants, to hand pull plants, you have to pull out a whole plant in its root system, hang it to dry. You can use something like pictured in this tool, which I know has been used in South Burlington, which is called a weed wrench, which can help you with larger plants. Spring is actually a great time to do this because the soil is wet. The problem is that unless the plant's really small, you're probably not going to get that whole root system out. And because those plants are so good at layering, at sprouting, each one of those root fragments is going to sprout and make a new plant. So mark where you pulled so you can go back and pull root sprouts, and just plan on, you're going to go back to that site over and over and over again, and you're going to keep pulling and keep pulling and keep pulling. And eventually, it is possible, depending on the plant, depending on the size of it, that you will kill that plant. And if they're really small, it's easy because you just pull the whole thing out, no big deal. One of the important things when we're thinking about what type of invasive control is appropriate is that we want to think about choosing, I guess, assessing the situation that we're in, the species that we have, how big they are, how advanced the infestation is, and then choosing a treatment method which is appropriate to that. So mechanical treatment is appropriate mostly for smaller localized infestations, so infestations that are not covering a huge area. It's appropriate for smaller plants that can easily be pulled out of the ground. It's appropriate for certain plants, depending on the type of mechanical treatment. So like with barberry, some people have had some success with burning. With poison parsnip, some people have had success with digging, especially with this shovel called the parsnip predator. It's also appropriate if you're a landowner who's like really intense and you have a lot of time and energy and determination, physical stamina, or you have the money to hire someone to spend a lot of time doing this. It is no mechanical treatment is the financially least burdensome treatment method, not even close. And if you're a landowner and you got a little patch of plants and they're small and easy to pull, and you can do it and it's not a big deal, by all means do that. That's the best. But in a lot of situations, that's not appropriate. And so what you got to do is just sort of think about what plants do I have? What level of treatment do I have? And even if it makes me uncomfortable, is this thing that I'm trying to do actually going to work? So one thing I will say is that I have seen very small scale mechanical treatment be successful. So hand pulling on a very small scale. I have never seen a larger scale, completely mechanical treatment on a large population of invasive plants be effective. And what I usually tell people is that it's not that you can't kill invasive plants using mechanical treatment, it's that you won't, because the level of tenacity that is required is like, it's like next level intensity. If you want to cut a buckthorn plant to death, it requires repeated treatments again and again and again and again. I've heard that some of the cutting at Red Rocks has been pretty successful, but you got to go back and you got to cut them and cut them and cut them and cut them, right? And so if you're an individual landowner, you don't have the money to pay somebody to do that, you don't feel comfortable doing it yourself, you're probably not going to be effective, because you're not going to be able to go back there and cut that tree or that plant until it's dead. So the pros of mechanical treatment: no chemicals, which is great. The cons: it's physically intense. It requires you to go back again and again. And if you don't, you're going to be right back to square one. It'll be like you didn't do anything. And it can be effective, but it usually isn't, except on very small localized infestations, specific plants, small plants that can easily be pulled out of the ground. So one of the important things for us to think about as we think about what types of treatment is appropriate is that it's what I call a capacity issue. So you need to consider how much time, money, and energy do you have? What else could you be potentially doing with your time, money, energy to protect the healthier forest? Are you potentially controlling a small area of invasives and letting the whole rest of this problem run rampant? And are you setting yourself up to get frustrated and give up? Almost everybody who I talk, and this, I'm not trying to exaggerate, I'm just saying from experience, almost everybody that I talk to who wants to do completely mechanical invasive treatment and has a larger scale infestation is doing one of these things. So they're targeting all their resources, whether it's money resources, whether it's time or energy, on a very small area, not controlling it, and then giving up. And so the problem with that is that even if you are able to control a small area and you've got, you control your 1 acre and you've got 100 acres that also need work, you could be, if you were doing something more efficient and using a different treatment method or partially using a different treatment method, you could be treating all these other areas. In the case of South Burlington, if there was, some hybrid methodology, maybe using a little bit of chemical treatment in some situations, more treatment could occur and it would be more effective. And so it would be protecting more of the ecosystems that South Burlington's responsible for. So that brings us to chemical control. So chemical control is controlling these invasive plants using herbicide. And for some reason, and it's weird because I don't even like herbicide, but I've recognized in my work that there is a direct correlation between people who are willing to use herbicide and people who actually have meaningful control over their invasive plant populations. People who use herbicide do, people who don't use herbicide don't, in my experience. And so because this is such a profound threat to our biodiversity, and such a profound threat to our ecosystems that I'm seeing play out at this huge scale across this whole county and across huge parts of the state, we're like, okay, so this herbicide thing, it makes us uncomfortable, but how can we use this in a way that's responsible as a restoration tool to get us to a place where our ecosystems are healthier? There's a few different types of treatments that I'll talk about briefly. What I call cut stump treatment, foliar spray, what I call a snip and drip. One of the crazy things about this, again, one of the really tricky things about all this stuff and a lot of the work that I do is helping people understand why doing something that's uncomfortable can actually be positive in a broader sense. So we all know what glyphosate is, right? It's the active ingredient in Roundup. It's the most widely used herbicide in the world. I think still in Vermont, it's actually the second most widely used after atrazine. And it is by far the most environmentally responsible herbicide on the market. It is head and shoulders more responsible to our ecosystems to use than any other herbicide out there. But people know what glyphosate is, and so they use other herbicides. And in the question and answer session, I'm happy to talk more about glyphosate specifically, but it's what we all use. And by that, I mean virtually every conservation organization in Vermont is using chemical control because we all recognize that it's effective and it's worth it, and we can do it really safely and responsibly, and specifically using glyphosate. So when is chemical treatment appropriate? Chemical treatment is appropriate when you have larger infestations of invasive plants, larger than a few plants or a small area. You have large plants, so those are individual plants that are too large to pull out by hand, like a big buckthorn. There are certain species that are really difficult to control using mechanical methods that have little small stems and really intense root systems, like barberry, multiflora rose, Japanese knotweed, oriental bittersweet. And if you're in a pinch, you don't have tons of time, energy, physical stamina, or money, chemical treatment is a better way to actually get control done. This is my favorite treatment of the chemical methodologies. It's called, or the chemical treatment methods. It's called the cut stump treatment. And basically what this is that you're cutting stems of these invasive plants, and you're treating the cut surface of the stem with a concentrated herbicide plus a dye. So you're applying a fraction of an ounce of an herbicide directly to the surface, to the cut surface of a stem, and letting that plant then translocate that tiny little bit of herbicide throughout the plant. It's super minimal, it's super targeted, it only gets on that one plant. And again, I use this tool called the Buckthorn Blaster, which is this tool here on the left. It's a 4-ounce bingo dauber. You put 2 ounces of glyphosate concentrate in it and 2 ounces of water and a dye. And those 2 ounces of herbicide is enough to treat hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of plants. I treated with it on my own property for 6 hours of constant treatment, and that's how much it took to use literally 2 ounces, half of that bottle worth of herbicide. So it's really, really cool. The Buckthorn Blaster is just such a phenomenal tool. And, you know, one of the things that's really amazing about it is if your primary concern is human health, it limits your exposure to virtually zero. So, you know, if you're wearing gloves, your exposure is zero because it's not spilling, it's not getting anywhere it's not supposed to be, it's not getting on you, it has a screw top, it's completely tight, and you're just dabbing a little sponge on the surface of those plants. It costs $6. It's a super great tool, and it's really helping a lot of people who want to deal with invasive plants but are uncomfortable with herbicide usage in general, see how this is just a super targeted restoration tool, which is applying herbicide in a way which is fundamentally different from the type of herbicide usage that's problematic, like mass broadcasting of herbicide from planes or mass spraying of it over huge fields, which is where we see all those negative effects associated with it. Foliar spray also can be very surgical. A really great case in point of this is at the La Platte Headwaters Town Forest, where we did this, and it was like pretty amazing how there was sort of buckthorn that was mixed in with all this regeneration. And when you go there, you can see that it's literally just individual buckthorn are dead, and every tree around it is completely healthy and alive. It's using a much more diluted herbicide, and it's applied to leaves during the growing season. So applied to the living leaves, you have to cover like 75% of the leaf area to kill a targeted plant. And it's appropriate for smaller plants in a dense infestation. So this is a barberry infestation from Westford, and you could never go and treat each one of these teeny little barberry stems individually. You just couldn't do it. And so, you know, I had a barberry infestation very much like this over about 10 acres of my property in Bolton, and this was the only way to do it. You don't apply it to tall plants where you're spraying way up high because then you get herbicide particles drifting everywhere. You're applying it to smaller plants when there's no wind and there's no rain in the forecast, and it's super, super, super effective on certain plants. Rules and regulations. So herbicide application is, there's a pretty tight hold on it in Vermont. You can apply herbicides, some herbicides, Class B herbicides on your own land. To apply on other people's lands, you need to be a licensed pesticide applicator. Becoming a licensed pesticide applicator, I would actually recommend it. It's easy. The Agency of Agriculture offers a day-long course. You take the course in the morning, and then you take the test in the afternoon, and then you're a licensed applicator. And then you need to get additional category certifications for to apply in the forest, etc., which are, you just take the test on your own. You got to follow the label. So the label is going to tell you like what level of PPE you should be wearing, when it's appropriate to apply, on what species it's appropriate to apply, how much you should apply, etc. And on a lot of these, there'll be like a booklet that'll be attached to the front of the jug, and you have to follow that label. That's the law. So in practice, in many cases, what I'm actually doing on my own land and what I'm advising people to do is a hybrid approach, because the goal is not that we just want to use herbicide and that we think herbicide is totally fine and we want to spray it everywhere and we don't care. The goal is, you know, I'm out there and I'm like, okay, I only eat organic food and I want to use this as a tool because I understand the importance of biodiversity. And I understand that this is the methodology that's going to get us to a place where our ecosystems can be healthy. But I don't want to use any more than I have to. And so in practice, what I'm usually doing is one of these things. So I'm hand pulling smaller plants, and I'm doing a cut stump treatment on larger plants that I can't pull up by hand. So then you're pulling. Here's a larger buckthorn. I'm going to cut it and treat it. Pulling. Here's a larger plant. I'm going to cut it and treat it. Sometimes I'll just be out and I'll be hand pulling plants. And if I break a root off in the soil, I'll find the root and I'll treat that so it won't resprout. But most of the time I'm just pulling it out by hand and it's going great. In some cases, I'm hand pulling some species and treating others. So there are some species that are easier to pull and some species that are harder to pull. So like in my case, you know, glossy buckthorn is a pretty easy species to pull when it's small. And oriental bittersweet is a species that can have a root that's 100 feet long. So there's no point trying to pull that if it's pretty established. So I'll treat that and then I'll pull the glossy buckthorn. This is a really, really important thing to understand. So again, the herbicide is not the goal, it's a tool in our toolkit. And it will be part of how we solve these invasive problems on the landscape. There is no future in which we are going to solve the level of biological invasions that we have in our ecosystems without using herbicide. And so the question is, are we willing to do this thing that's a little bit uncomfortable and that works? Or are we going to say, no, we're not going to do that, and just going to let it happen how it happens? And we know what happens because you don't have to imagine it. You can go into, you know, one of the many forests in Chittenden County, which are just lost to these species, or you can go south and you can see firsthand what happens when it gets really, really bad, and ask the landscape managers and the natural resource managers down there what it's like. One of the benefits of getting on these problems early, again, is that you have more options. So it's just like down south where they have these massive overpopulations of deer. So they let the deer population get to a certain level, and then suddenly there's very little that you can do about it. You have to hire snipers, or you have to try and catch these deer and surgically sterilize them, make all these really tough decisions. Whereas if you're in a state like Vermont and our deer population is just barely getting higher than where we want it to be, we can still reduce our population using recreational hunting. Recreational hunting is a little bit uncomfortable, but it's not nearly as uncomfortable as hiring professional snipers to come in and kill dozens of deer in a night. Using a little bit of herbicide helps us get to the place where we don't have to later use a lot of herbicide if we want to correct these problems. And it's just one of many strategies to sort of protect our ecosystems. This is the one that works the best, but we also need to be adaptive. And we need to be thinking about, you know, if a strategy comes up that works better, we should be using that. This is just a tool that gets us to a better place. And this is something that I'm encouraging people to think about a lot. You know, it's simple. but we need to do the right thing even when it's hard. So when something is hard, when something challenges us in some way, it doesn't mean that it's wrong. It just means that, you got to sort of take a deep breath and do what you got to do to protect our ecosystems. Controlling invasives I find it to be rewarding, but it's not fun. It's challenging, it's frustrating, it's time consuming, it's expensive. You get these crazy days of doing this like backbreaking work, but and it requires us to like ideologically stretch ourselves. Like I never thought that I would be doing a presentation for you about how you should use herbicide. It's uncomfortable, but at the same time, it's the right thing to do. So vtinvasives.org is a great resource that's maintained by the state of Vermont for identification and information on all kinds of invasive species, from plants to pests and pathogens. You can find a lot of great resources on there, so definitely check that out. That's a picture of spotted knapweed, which is an up-and-comer in Vermont. And some other resources, the NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service, funds invasive species control and some wildlife habitat enhancement practices through the program that's called EQUIP, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, which is a really great resource. They won't fund invasive treatment unless you're using herbicide, because it usually doesn't work. But they do provide funding for private landowners to do this work. A great resource for just a general educational resource is the Nature Conservancy's Vermont Landowner's Guide to Invasive Terrestrial Plant Management, which you can find online. And also, I'd just say, no matter what county you're in, you have a county forester, and I'd recommend that you get in touch with them. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen if I can figure out how. And I would love to take any questions that you have.
So Ethan, I see in the chat, any special comments about goutweed?
Boy, goutweed is really tough. Where I see goutweed being, it's a common like yard escapee. So a lot of times it's either creeping out from people's garden beds where they planted it as a ground cover, or people got sick of it, they pulled it out, they threw it over the bank, and then now it's creeping over there. The places where I've seen it be really bad is in floodplains for some reason. So the Intervale is almost pure goutweed. If you go down there, it's like the ground cover is I don't know, 80% goutweed. And the Riverwalk in Richmond, where I live, is similar. I have heard of some people have some success with smothering on small patches of goutweed, or hand pulling and smothering. I don't know too much about it because it usually isn't a forest plant, but yeah, smothering is what I've heard of. And what you should do with goutweed and with garlic mustard and some of these other plants is pull them and bag them. So put them in a bag. You can also some of them you can dry, some of them you need to bag them and bring them to the dump, or bring them to like that industrial compost place in Williston on Redmond Road that composts at a hot enough temperature that it'll destroy invasive seeds. Because garlic mustard, believe it or not, you can cut garlic mustard and it can still flower and seed. So you got to put it in a bag.
All right, there's another question about wild grapevines. How serious are they, and are they worthy of removing?
So our native vine, so there's the invasive vine that we have that's non-native is Oriental bittersweet. There's also a native bittersweet, but it's uncommon. We have two native vines, Virginia creeper and wild grapevines. And one of the interesting things about them is that they are native species. They have a role in our ecosystems, but like some of these other species, like white-tailed deer in some circumstances, they're a native species that can behave very invasively in response to human-created conditions. So while it is native to this landscape, it is not necessarily native to this landscape as it currently exists. And so on my land, what I'll see is that along edges, which is a totally artificial human-created environment, and like a hard edge alongside a highway or a power line or something like that, these vines can behave really, really aggressively, and they can actually be a real hazard to forest growth and development. So I've treated Virginia creeper and wild grape like an invasive in many cases, where it seems like they're arresting that process of forest development in response to a human created condition. That said, if there's just a patch of wild grape in the middle of the woods, that is how it grows naturally, and it is a native species. So it's tricky. It's a balance.
I have another question about what is the purpose of the dye in the solution with the buckthorn blaster, and what dye to use?
So I haven't tried that many different kinds. I use like a turf dye because it's really strong. But I know that my friend Pat in Heinsberg, that she didn't want to buy the buckthorn blasters for $6 a pop. She found you could buy just literally 4-ounce bingo daubers on the internet that you'd use to like stamp a bingo card if you're playing bingo. She emptied out half the ink and filled the other half up with herbicide. I think probably food coloring or something like that would work. Basically, the point is just that you can see that you've treated the whole stem. So you can see that you've gotten the coverage that you want, because herbicide and water are clear. So you just want to make sure that you've got good coverage over the stem. I actually have a YouTube video that's like 5 minutes long on my YouTube channel that is really what describes basically that type of cut stump treatment with that tool, the buckthorn blaster, on my YouTube page. I can get that for you and put it in the chat. If I can find it.
Sorry, I was muted.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just saying, I see Ray has his hand up, and then I'll go back to the chat after he asks his question.
Cool.
This is a statement, not a question.
Yeah.
I'm good for statements. Wild grapes. I don't want this group to be left with the impression that wild grapes should be eliminated almost wherever they're found, for these two reasons. Number one is they're one of the very best wildlife foods. Grouse, bear, turkeys, squirrels, raccoons, anything, coyotes, fox, they all eat grapes. So it's a very valuable wildlife food. The second point about it is that they can sometimes grow very dense. I've seen them destroy young trees. They just cover the whole top. But on the other hand, in Pennsylvania, where I was raised around town, there was a forest that was growing up. We had a canopy and it was full of wild grapes, but they were not destroying trees because those particular trees got ahead of the grapevines.
Right.
Whereas other places where I saw the grapevines get ahead of the trees after logging, then it killed some trees there. But in the end, always the forest won. It didn't stop the forest from growing up and becoming. And so it was super. I'm a hunter, outdoorsman, and so it was super hunting. And I don't see anything like it up here anymore, and I kind of miss that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I also try and create from a forest management perspective is that we see that like old growth forests have all like these what we call canopy gaps. So they have this patchy, irregular canopy, and most of our forests in Vermont are like less than 100 years old, and they haven't yet had a chance to develop that kind of irregularity and diversity. And one of the roles, I think, of wild grape in the forest is creating gaps, right? Like pulling trees down and creating these gaps in the forest. And so definitely, yeah, they have a role, and I definitely see them. I see them also behaving really aggressively only on edges. So that's what I would say. I mean, it's the same thing about like I would say about deer, where deer are a native species, but exposed to non-native conditions, so decreasing winter severity and increase in posted land and the loss of their historic apex predators, deer can also become invasive. But then it's this nuance of like we still want deer to be healthy. We want them to have great habitat, we want them to be at a level where they can be healthy, but at the same time, we don't want them to become like they are in Massachusetts, where there's, many orders of magnitude more deer than the landscape can support. So stuff like that is super tricky, and all I can say is that it varies from place to place.
All right. Another question is about the best management practices for herbicide treatment of barberries, strength of glyphosate, and when best to apply.
Barberry is tricky. This is the one that I've dealt with the most because, like I said, I had pretty much 10 acres, wall-to-wall, pure understory of barberry, waist high. It was unreal. It's not there anymore. But what I used with plants like that, another plant like that is multiflora rose. They have a lot of little stems. It is possible to cut all the stems and to treat them with a cut stump treatment. But what's much more efficient is to use a foliar spray. And so when you're using a foliar spray, you just have to be a little bit more careful because, obviously you're not applying that herbicide directly to the cut surface of the stump. You're applying it in a way that's, you're spraying it. And I'm using a little $50 hand pump backpack sprayer where I'm still applying it to individual plants. And the mortality of plants I'm not trying to kill is very, very low. So that's what I would say is the best treatment method. Again, with a foliar spray, you're talking about 2 to 4% concentration. With a cut stump spray, you're talking about 20 to 40% concentration. In either case, I'm using herbicide concentrate, which is usually 40%, and I'm watering it down 10 to 20 parts to 1 for foliar spray, and I'm watering it down by half, usually if I'm doing cut stump application. So you don't want to get those little formulations. You don't want to use Roundup anyway. Roundup is a formulation that has a lot of other stuff in it. You want to be using something with the active ingredient glyphosate. Preferably that's wetland safe, that has surfactants and additives that are safe for our salamanders and our amphibians and stuff like that. And you want to concentrate with like 40% active ingredient, and then you want to dilute it.
I have a question here about wall lettuce. Will wall lettuce still bloom after pulled up and piled to dry?
Who asked about wall lettuce?
Eleanor Osborne.
Hey, Eleanor. Wall lettuce is one that has just popped onto my radar. It's one of these things. A lot of these invasive plants, you don't know. Some of them are like a little bit invasive, but not that scary. Like, not like buckthorn or bittersweet status scary. But wall lettuce, I heard about it. A lot of us just heard about it like 3 years ago. There's this forest health updates that you can get sent out, Vermont Forest Health updates from the Forest Health Department. And they mentioned something about wall lettuce, and I was like, I've never seen that before. And then I was at the Heinsberg Town Forest getting ready for this forest management project, and I saw, I think, like 1 or 2 of them. And then last year, in an area where it managed, they exploded. It was a huge amount of them. And so I'm just learning about it. But what I've read is if they're flowering, you need to pull them and bag them. If they're not flowering yet, you don't need to. You can just hand pull them and lay them on the ground to dry. But I don't know a ton about it because it's sort of new to me.
I've never heard of that one either.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. There's some crazy statistics about like how many new plants, organisms, pathogens are being introduced onto our continent every day. It's crazy. There's all these weird different ways that it happens. I guess what do they call it? Water that is carried around in boats, in the hold of boats, is like a huge way that organisms are introduced. But also, plants just get planted. Like all these invasive plants were introduced intentionally. They're not like the emerald ash borer where they came over on some packing material or something. They were introduced intentionally by people to do different things. So in the case of barberry, it was an ornamental, still is in many people's yards. Burning bush, same thing. Honeysuckle, same thing. In the case of buckthorn and multiflora rose, people were using it as a living fence. In the case of Bittersweet, there's people I work with who are not old who remember planting bittersweet in power line corridors because the idea was that it was going to pull it down, pull all the vegetation down and keep it from growing up around the power lines. Some of them were even planted for wildlife habitat, ironically, stuff like autumn olive. So yeah, it's pretty crazy.
Ray, I'm gonna go through another question in the chat if you can just hold on 1 second, okay? So another one here is, when can you start planting where you've used herbicide, and what would be good to plant to discourage the invasives from growing back? And I also see that Drew shared a link that I'll just put in the chat for everybody to see in case it's useful. But go ahead, Ethan.
Yeah, so it depends. So usually, unless the invasive problem is really bad, I don't replant. It's certainly something that we're thinking about, especially in these areas that are like wall to wall 100% invasives, where we just think we're just going to continue to get waves and waves and waves of invasives. There is some benefit to replanting, because then, long term, what's going to solve that problem is establishing a canopy, and then we'll be able to get less invasives and we'll be able to control them more easily. And another time when you might want to plant is in areas where there's very high invasive populations around, and there's an open area that you're trying to let revert into forest. And so if you just let it go, it's just going to get all full of invasives. But if you plant it, you're going to get less. I would say that it depends on the species. If you're going to do planting, when you want to plant, it would depend on the species. With some of these species, they have seeds that can be persistent in the soil for a long time. Not a long time, but for several years. So like buckthorn, it's like 2 to 3 years. And so you would probably want to make sure that you had dealt with all those, with the plants themselves, and then dealt with the residual sprouting of those seeds that are in the seed bank of the soil that are viable but have not germinated in the soil before you planted. Would be what I would think. But it depends. I mean, on my land, even in areas where these invasive plant problems are pretty bad, I just killed the invasives, and our ecosystems are pretty resilient. And now I just have native plants everywhere. And so it's a very different paradigm. Like also in forest management, we don't plant trees ever. Like I'm like lost. I don't know how to do that because what we do is we just create an opening. We just create space. We create light. We create a disturbance, and the forest just fills in the gap. And so that would be what I would do, unless it was like really, really bad invasive plant problem.
All right, thank you, Ethan. Ray, you saw your hand was up? Did you want to ask another question?
It was, but I guess it's an age thing. I forgot what the question was, but I'll contribute something. This garlic mustard is an edible green, and I know it grows in our area, and I have yet to pick it and eat it, but I will.
Yeah, there's certainly, just because they're invasive doesn't mean they're devoid of benefits. I know that there's a lot of people who are excited about, with Japanese knotweed, they're excited about that the root has some properties that are beneficial towards Lyme's disease. And I'm like, wow, that's great. And don't worry, there's always going to be plenty of knotweed. I think that, in order to be good stewards, I'm not saying that you were saying this about the garlic mustard, but in order to be good stewards of our ecosystems, we have to sort of move past the mindset that everything exists just for us, and that if it has a human benefit, that it's good, and sort of think about ourselves as stewards of the ecosystem, where the ecosystem is also something that has value in and of itself, just as it is. So one thing, and again, not saying that you were saying this, I'm just saying that
I thought of it as a way to help control the invasive.
Totally. Yeah. If we could mobilize all the people who say that knotweed is good for curing Lyme's disease and get them to actually kill knotweed by pulling it out, that would be amazing. But it's not a one-to-one on those things. But I know that some people have had some success just sort of like doing these events where people are eating, harvesting and eating these invasive species. And then it's a good way to educate people about that these are invasives and these are the ways why they're problematic to our landscape. But I also see, sometimes I call it invasive plant deniers. And so these are, there's a lot of people out there who also like dealing with invasive plants is just really challenging and it's just super, super, super hard. And there's a lot of people who just like can't handle it and don't want to deal with it. And so similar to climate change deniers, they're leaning on this very small amount of research, which is super tenuous about like a situation where an invasive plant became a useful part of an ecosystem. And that's not borne out by the way that the scientific community as a whole thinks about these invasive plants. The way that the scientific community thinks about them is as an existential threat to our ecosystems, which needs to be resolved. So that's something that I encounter people who, especially people who really don't want to use chemical treatment as any part of the treatment methodology. A lot of the times people are trying to then sort of justify that by talking about these other theories of how invasive plants are going to become part of our ecosystems, which they will eventually in thousands of years, probably, but they won't today. And so that's really, really important to note.
I just want to add before I go to the next one, in my day of removing lots of garlic mustard, I actually had a pretty good garlic mustard pesto recipe that I have to find again. But it actually wasn't bad. So you can do lots of things with invasives.
I think knotweed makes like really good, like a rhubarby tasting like applesauce you can make out of it.
I'll have to try that one next.
Yeah.
I have another question for you about grapevines, and the question is, Sarah Dopp wrote this one. She assumed that the grapevines she had all over the place were the result of having grapes intentionally planted on an arbor years ago. Is that true, or is it a wild grapevine, a different species?
Hey, Sarah. I've never heard of domestic grapes escaping, but I think it would be pretty clear because they'd be growing like wild grapes are like really tiny little grapes. I would assume that you could tell by the fruit. I would think they would be wild ones, but I'm not sure. It could be domestic ones that have escaped. I know that there's some really weird stuff like at the Audubon Center in Huntington, they have this what they thought was like an invasive crab apple, something weird, but it turned out it's this thing called a calorie pear, which is just a weird kind of like renegade pear that just like grows like crazy, like an invasive, and takes over. So
they look like the same fruit to me as the ones on my arbor, but yes, they are smaller. And I assumed that birds were eating them, and the fruit sometimes drops to the ground, and I figured the seeds were just going all over the place.
I have no idea. I really don't know how you tell.
Yeah,
the domestic one versus a wild one. Sorry. I hope they're a domestic one. That'd be kind of cool.
Yeah, it was to begin with.
You can tell by the size of the grapes. I mean, as a kid, I ate the wild grapes all the time. We also had domestic grapes that went wild. We called them fox grapes, which were much bigger. And then we had domestic grapes that went wild, and they were still nice, really good, small but really good, very different than the wild. So the native wild grape is very easy to tell.
Huh.
Maybe you can stop by someday, Ray, and I'll show you.
All right, I have another. This might be the last one in the chat. I don't know if it's the last one of all, but it's a question about purple loosestrife and the best way to control that.
Boy, purple loosestrife, I really don't know. I know there's a lot of people though who are more in the wetlands world who have spent a lot of time and energy to do this. I know that there is a biocontrol. So I think an insect that controls it pretty effectively. But I don't know any more than that, just because I don't usually intersect with that just because I mostly work in the woods. Do you know more about that, Ashley?
I've not really. I didn't do a lot of removal of it back in my day in Wisconsin, but I do recall at the time there was the biological pest that they were starting to introduce to start to manage some of those populations. But it's really unclear to me like where that got to and which states might be doing that and how successful it's been. So yeah, Ethan's probably right. One of the folks, well, and even maybe Elizabeth at the state, she might have some information or resources she could point you towards at btinvasives.org.
Yeah, there probably are resources there, and I guess with most, so I don't know if this is a distinction that most people think about, but like I think about woody plants versus herbaceous plants. So woody plants are like just like trees and shrubs. Herbaceous plants are like annual plants that die back in the winter. Um, and with most herbaceous plants like loosestrife, I think about hand pulling them. Like garlic mustard, I hand pull. Um, yeah, I mean, I think that they have less established root systems, so they're easier to hand pull. The only time when you might want to use herbicide is if you had like a really dense, incredibly extensive infestation, where it just becomes a lot more efficient to use herbicide through a foliar spray. But usually, because they're so easy to pull, my instinct is with herbaceous stuff like that to hand pull them.
Hey, Ethan,
Yeah.
this is Bob. Loose stripe is very difficult to pull. And
Is it?
the beetle, the Garriosella beetle, there was a program, U.S. Fish and Wildlife was breeding them in Vermont and releasing them. I don't think they're doing that anymore. They do it in New York State, and it's actually considered pretty successful. It doesn't eradicate, but it definitely keeps it in check.
That's what I heard.
We've had releases in Charlotte that is years back that really made a difference. So that would be a great thing for someone somehow in Vermont to get going again.
Bob, so you're going to volunteer to do that, and then what do you think, if it's hard to hand pull, what would you use on loose strife, Bob? Or what would you do?
I guess I have sprayed it, foliar, with rodeo. I don't know. Because it's in wetlands, I really don't, typically, I mean, you have some drier installations which would classify more as wet meadow but it can be actually like shallow emergent. And I don't like to spray in those. So cut, try to pull, but cut, because at least if you cut it off, you are keeping it in check.
Yeah.
Yeah, cut the flowers.
Yep.
Yeah, I think, and when it gets into wetland stuff, it also becomes a whole nother thing, and it just sort of shows one of the really interesting things about the way that we apply herbicide in the sort of ecological, in the restoration community versus the way that it's applied 99% of all the times that it's applied, is that usually what's happening with herbicide is it's being applied indiscriminately across huge areas. So we're talking about applying over 100-acre fields of Roundup ready corn or grain. Some of it is food that is going to be eaten. There's very high levels of glyphosate specifically that's been found in stuff like non-organic oats, and even in traces in organic oats. And in a lot of these, stuff like, I think Stacy's pita chips had like a lot of glyphosate in it, and some other specific products. But, and a lot of times when people talk about it being like in water, what they're talking about is these massive broadcast sprays, which have been sprayed from huge tractors, or in the case of how it's used in commercial forestry in other parts of the country, from planes. It's getting into the water by being sprayed onto the surface of groundwater. One of the things about glyphosate specifically as a chemical, that is the reason that most of us use it, is because it, unless it's applied to the surface water, which it should never be, soil particles bond very strongly with it, so it's not leaching out into groundwater. It's degrading relatively quickly in the ecosystem compared to all the other herbicides. It doesn't bioaccumulate, and it's really pretty innocuous. But that is, it's not something that means that I want to stand in a field of Roundup ready corn and get sprayed all over with it, or that I think it's appropriate to be sprayed on, on the surface of water. And so there are, like you said, there are aquatic formulations, there are wetland safe formulations, but we're a lot more careful with that stuff than, how 99% of all this glyphosate and other herbicides are used.
All right, you did have a question pop up too about wild chervil and if that's considered an invasive.
It is. Yeah, you're gonna see that's when early summer, all those white flowers along the side of the road are wild chervil, and that is non-native. Not something that we see in the woods a lot, but in some of our open environments. And again, that's like a whole nother world. Some of these field invasive plants like poison parsnip, chervil, and spotted knapweed, and loosestrife, and reed canary grass, that come into non-forested open environments, wetland type environments. It's like a whole nother world.
All right, there are no more questions in the chat box. So does anybody else still on the webinar tonight have any other questions for Ethan? Please feel free to turn your screens on or raise your hands or. Okay, not seeing anybody.
Well, so this stuff, I just want to acknowledge that I've been doing this a long time, and I believe in it, as far as like using herbicide as a tool in restoration, but it still is not easy, and all of this stuff is really complex and nuanced and super challenging, and so I just want to offer that if any of you have other questions about this stuff, please feel free to contact me, and I'll try to answer them or to help you find someone who can answer your questions. And to also say that I put that video in the chat. That's specific to using that buckthorn blaster, that tool that I really, really appreciate. That's on my YouTube channel, and there's some other resources on my YouTube channel as well about managing invasives.
Oh, yes, and I will also add, we're hoping to get some of the links to Ethan's channel and some of his videos in particular up on the city website. Now I'm blanking on the specific location, but I believe there is a section on the Recreation and Parks site that has information about the Weed Warrior program and other resources for invasive plants. But you can always just reach out and contact me as well, and I can also try to help get you information. So I think with that, I want to thank Ethan again. Ethan, I was thinking about a year ago, we were doing our first virtual experience, and I'm.
Oh yeah.
So it's pretty.
We're a lot better at it now, I hope. That was
but yeah, so anyway, yeah, thank you so much.
You're welcome. No problem.
But if you guys are interested, this is part of our community hike series. Next month, you'll be starting to see some information come from me. We're going to be sharing some videos to get you all ready for the spring ephemeral season. And then we're also going to be doing an April stools cleanup that'll be led by a couple of our Vermont master naturalists. So stay tuned for information on those events in April. But thanks, Ethan, so much for your talk tonight.
Thanks for coming out. Have a good night, everybody.
Have a great night, guys.
Bye. Thank you.